I'm delighted to be here and recovered from my adventures of yesterday, and happy to be here with you. And I'm going to be talking about groups this morning, so I want to tell you that looking out at you as an old teacher, I respect that you're primarily educators. But coming into this room, you've acted rather like your students. Sat at the edges of the room, leaving a big empty spot in the middle, and so on. But I hope that that won't inhibit you from understanding this. So I want to talk to you about three things. First, the dual economy, how we got into this kind of situation we are today. Second of all, the role of race in this situation. And finally, the third point is what we can do about it as educators. Okay, so let's start with a lovely graph that has come out. Not lovely, but it's very clear. And so the Pew Research Center put this together going from 1970 to 2014. That's as to the present, basically, getting data. They divided the population into the upper, middle, and lower groups by their income. And if you look at the kind of brown line going down, you see that the middle class is disappearing. Now, that's not to say that each member of the middle class is disappearing. What is measured here is the share of aggregate income that the people in these groups get. And you see that the share of the middle class has gone down from over 3/5 of the total to just over 2/5 of the total. So if we extrapolate this, who knows where it will go. Of course, that income hasn't gone to the poor, people that you're dealing with a lot in Mississippi. It's gone to the upper class, which you see has more or less doubled its share of income. Okay, and so that's a way to do it in numbers. Here's a way to do it in words from Ta-Nehisi Coates' new book, which I recommend to all of you, and so on. And so I won't read it, but you can read it clearly and see that he's saying the very same thing. I'll talk about criminal justice, and we can talk a lot about something darker. Okay. The way I want to deal with this is to use a model by W. Arthur Lewis that is 60 years old. And it's an old model, and it was put together to explain conditions in developing countries. Now, Professor Lewis was a professor of economics, came from the West Indies, got his degree in England, lived in England, and then came to the United States after writing this paper, and ended his career at Princeton University in New Jersey. And he was actually the only black winner of the Nobel Prize in economics. So on, although being from outside the United States, he always resisted that, putting him into that particular box. So what does the concept of the dual economy consist of? And he argued that in a lot of developing countries, in countries that were just beginning out in the process of industrialization in the early part of the 20th century, there are two sectors. One of which was the modern sector, capitalist, he called it, where you had factories and the kind of economy we think of today. And the other one was subsistence. And this was for economies which had essentially large populations of sharecroppers or other poor farmers who were doing this. And so it just led to a dual economy. Now, how did they relate to each other? What does it mean to be a dual economy in the context of being a single economy? Well, you could make the transition from the subsistence economy to the capitalist economy by going to the city, which is where the capitalists and the factories and everything were. And so you could go up there, and people would go up there because they had a higher expected wage. And the term expected wage is one of the economics jargon, so I've explained it there. It's the higher wage that you can get in the capitalist sector times the probability that even though you make this transition or try to make this transition, that you actually do get a job. And so Dr. Hammer was talking about unemployment earlier, and that's how it comes into this model, and I'll come back to that for that. So on. Okay, so how do we apply that to today? What does that look like from the point of view today? Because it's a model of a developing country, so that the model was setting off to be optimistic, whereas the American economy, I'm maintaining, is kind of moving backwards in this intellectual historical sense, toward going from a better economy backwards into the condition of a dual economy. And so I call the upper sector today the FTE sector, emphasizing the parts of it, finance, technology, electronics, for that, which are the kind of drivers of what's happening today. And if you think back about the context in which Lewis wrote in the 1950s, that's 60 years ago, he would have put manufacturing. But as we all know, manufacturing in the United States has been decreasing very much to be replaced by these kinds of activities. And the earnings in the sector took off in the 1980s. So thank you. That happens in my classes too, so I know all about it. Okay. And the low-wage sector, which includes then, if we go back to this, the low-wage sector is then the combination of the middle who've been forced down into this and the lower groups of the Pew Foundation. There, 80%. And the transition is not by going to the city, because it's not the economies of scale from having manufacturing production for that, but by education. And that is the link then between my concern about what's happening to the economy again and your concerns here about education in Mississippi. And so the argument, as I've developed it, is that students need a college education to go into the FTE sector. So if you look at the top line of this slide, you can appreciate that people need to have some skills in this kind of thing. But of course, education does much more of that, which I will talk about. And I want to also give a note of caution here, which is college education is necessary. That is to say, students need to have the skills and the ability to do technical things to join the FTE sector, to get a job there. but it's not sufficient. That is to say, it's not a guarantee that you will get there. It's not an automatic process. It's a process that goes on over time. So we will talk more about that. Now, the politics of the dual economy are a little scary because the FTE policy makes policy for itself, and it pretty well ignores what's going on in the low-wage sector. And Dr. Hammer gave preference to Milton Friedman, an economist, about this. But the economist, I mean, I'm an economist, and I would love to have economists rule the world. But there's some impediments there. And so this is being led also by a set of businessmen who have a kind of ideology rather than a kind of economic model of this for that, which harks back to Hayek earlier, to Ayn Rand today, and coming up, in which Milton Friedman represented a step, and a fairly technical one, in this process, but was kind of in the high tide of this. So the top 1%, you've seen that phrase around, the 1%, so on, dominates politics, come to figure. And what do they want? You know, when they make policy for themselves, they want low taxes. So the fact that you know, our roads, our bridges, our trains, and so on are falling apart, our educational system is falling apart, that doesn't concern them. All they want is smaller government for that. Research shows that, citing in that. But now this process shown in my slide has gone so far that we can talk about the 1% of the 1%. You know, that's a very small group of people, but they have political power too. And you could see that in the Republican debates, not by the content, you could also see that, but I don't want to get into that, but just by the sheer number of people that got into these debates so that everybody had to figure out how to reduce it to manageable size for it, because a candidate from the right only needs to have a few very, very rich people, billionaires, who to spend a couple of $1 million to finance a candidate is no big deal. It's the way you go to the corner store, you know, so that they could do that, so that we had this proliferation. So that's a kind of graphic illustration of how the 1% of the 1% is dominating our politics for it. So it's the candidates for the president. It's also conservative state governors, because after Citizens United, a Supreme Court decision in 2010, some of these very rich people in the top 1% of 1% realized that their money could go, you know, they're not stupid. They thought about it, and they realized that their money could go further, even though I'm saying it's not all their money by any manner of means, and that they go further in local elections. Democrats, we like to think, are intelligent too, but they were a little slow off the mark in this thing. And so they, 1% of the 1%, poured money into state elections and got a lot of conservative state governors. And then finally, just to summarize this, if you're the top 1% of the 1%, you don't drive on the same roads, you don't take the trains, you don't live in the areas that other people live in, and so they have no contact. So let me close this part with a few numbers. Here's the 1% in numbers. This is data from Thomas Piketty, who wrote a big book on this topic. From that, and you can see what happened, and you see the period. Can't see how old you all are, but the period I grew up in for all of this, and then took a sharp rise up starting in the 1980s for that. And if you look, that's the top 1%, which has been in the news. If you looked at the top 1% of the 1%, the curve would be even steeper. I mean, it is steeper. If I graphed it here, it would be even steeper. And then if you looked at the people, say, in the top 10%, it would be going up, but a little slower than this. And if you look even further going down in the FTE sector, if you look just at the wage premium from being a college graduate as opposed to only having a high school education. High school education leaves you in the low-wage sector. The college education at least gives you a chance to get into the FTE sector. That gap, that wage premium, has been going up as well. So this curve stands for a whole family of curves, all of which have this same shape of going up sharply, but the most sharply at the top. And then the comparable graph for the low-wage sector, and what you see, the orange line, is really the growth of the whole economy. And what you see is that along in the 1970s, right at the start of that first graph I had, something happened to the real wages of workers in good producing industries. And they haven't grown since. This has endured now for many, many years. So quite a thing there. Okay, I can talk more about the causes of that, but I'll leave that till later to come back to if we want to talk about that. What I want to do is talk about the effects of it, to turn to the role of race. Okay, so if we think about our politics and think about how the 1% makes its sells its ideas that you should privatize schools, as Dr. Hammer was talking about, privatize water systems that people talk about, privatize public transport, the public transportation system. In Massachusetts now, we have a Republican governor who is trying to privatize that in stages for that. And so it's all prefaced by this rhetoric of we and them, rich and poor, but it's directed at blacks, at African Americans, who are the they in this process. And so this is a long, long American practice, clearly, going for it at the pivotal time of change here, coming Nixon in the 1970s, starting in the late 60s, was the originator of what has been called in national politics, the Southern strategy, to appeal to white Southern people and to say that that we are sympathetic to your views on race. The idea of formal segregation is done, but separation still exists for this, and so the white Southerners could come along and support the Republican administration. So a big shift from the Democratic South to the Republican South for that. And Reagan, who did a lot of things, but the symbol I liked the best is that he announced his candidacy in Philadelphia, Mississippi. And I don't have to explain to this audience why that was. Again, what that was, but a very clear signal of what he was about in this tradition. And Trump today, making America great again, the language has changed, but not the intent. Instead of talking about race explicitly, because that's become a no-no in American policies, so they say making America great again. Great means white. So it's very clear what's happening. He's always talking about that, them, and so on. Excuse me for a minute while I get there. Okay. So, okay. Continuing on. Now, is the low-wage sector black? Because everybody's talking about them. And to state it rather crassly, there are not enough blacks to go around. That's the thing. African Americans are only about 14% of the population of the United States. The low-wage sector is 80% of the total. Little math. Rhonda's our mathematician here, but I'm sure you can all do this. It's a small part of this. So, the majority of low-wage workers are white, but they are invisible in this political kind of setting for that. And their needs are neglected because the policies affect not just black poor people, but white poor people as well. Why are they invisible? How can they be invisible? Well, first of all, they do not vote. So if you look at voting in Europe, which doesn't have the racial history of the United States, participation rates, number of people voting over relative to the age group there that you can vote, the participation rate is up around 80–90%, varying countries and so on. If you look in the United States, the proportion of the people voting is around 50%. A little more in presidential elections, a little less in other elections for that. But it's partly due to the lack of interest by poor whites, but it's also by intention. Poll taxes, voter IDs, things that are coming in to replace poll taxes, and so on, affect poor people. And it may be that there's a racist reason with poll taxes that makes us think of the race more so in our race-neutral dialogue of the current things. You say voter IDs, but it's the same thing, but it affects both whites and blacks. The poor whites get discouraged by loss of good jobs. That's where I started from. They are dying younger. Recent demographic data has just shown that. Why? Because they're in the behavior of discouraged and depressed people, taking drugs, committing suicide. But while the health of Americans generally is rising, the health of these poor, neglected whites is actually declining. So to return to our politics, what we have here is coded words and deeds for this with okay, where I am. And so it's there with the welfare queens in 1980, Trump and Cruz today, with we and they sitting there. So if you think about that graph, I started with Reagan's at the beginning of it, and Trump is Cruz where we are now. The language is indirect, but the reference is clear. Think about the war on drugs, started by Nixon, encouraged by people. It affects blacks more than whites, even though the use of drugs in the United States is not race conscious. Enough proportion of whites using marijuana and so on are similar, amazingly similar to the proportion of blacks using them, but blacks are much more likely to go to jail. In fact, a life study, a study of this from life tables done some years ago, but still valid, said 1 in 3 black males will go to prison during his lifetime. That's an absolutely extraordinary number. It's extraordinary just because it's a very large number in this case. We don't think of lots of people going to jail. It shows you how large our mass incarceration has gotten to. But you can also see the effects that it has in black communities. Because first of all, in the voting, felons often can't vote, so that gets to the exclusion I was talking about. They can't access government programs, can't get job training, and so on. So they get forced into this low-wage sector. But it also affects the dynamics of families, because every family knows someone in jail. And so it must seem hopeless for any kid then to try and make this transition into the FTE sector from the low-wage sector, because particularly young black males say, oh, well, what's the point? Likely go to jail anyway. Okay. So how does this work? Black men in jail implies single-parent families. Black women do the best they can, but single-parent families are poor of any color. For that, they have to live in poor areas. Ooh, look at that. Poorer areas. That's supposed to be, okay. With poor schools. Little misspelling there. Okay. The children are discouraged by the bad schools there, by the examples, again, of their missing jailed father. The children go out of scale, out of school, search around for activities, or maybe get discouraged like the poor whites, take drugs, end up in jail. And the situation, the condition of the dual economy continues, augments itself for that. So finally, coming to what we can do. First thing to do would be to reduce mass imprisonment. Costs about $50 billion a year. That money could be used to help education. So just to give you a number, states spend around that same amount of money on state universities. So the program that people say make college education, public education, free for college students, this would be one way to do it. And it's much better to think about educating people than jail people. But of course, that's not at the moment how our politics work. as I said, the rich determine public policy. They only want to lower their taxes and keep wages low. This is the model of the dual economy, as I started out with saying so. This is the application of this. So policy is made by the higher sector, the FTE sector. Costs are borne by the low-wage sector. And since I wrote the paper and now think about, I've all read about lead in the water in Flint, Michigan, this kind of lack of regard for poor people has just gotten in the way of everything. So if you think about this, how did this get to it? Well, the aging infrastructure of water delivery in Flint, which has become, since manufacturing disappeared, has become a poor black community, was there the finances were in trouble as a result of Supreme Court decisions in the 1970s for that. And so instead of, so the governor, the conservative government, there took over the finances of Flint, Michigan, but without giving any more resources to Flint to fix its water system. And so the administrator said, well, if we can't fix the system, we can just take water from the local river. And that's what has led to this public health disaster of lead getting into the water of children in Flint, Michigan. And that's currently under discussion. But if you follow the news about it, everybody wants to fix it. No one is willing to actually spend any money to fix it. And of course, it was the reluctance to spend money that created the problem. Once you have the problem, it's more money to fix it, but it's still hard to even raise that amount of money. So this is back there, going back to the race issue, and I would argue this goes all the way back to the legacy of slavery. The FTE sector controls the low-wage sector by essentially continuing race hatred. It's by other means. I've read a good book. Let me not going there. I'm getting bored there. And the use, as the war on drugs show, of confrontation rather than cooperation. And so the police act to repress the poor, whereas public policy neglects their needs. And poor whites, the neglected poor whites, are encouraged to feel good about all of this by feeling superior to the blacks. Okay, so the mortality, to go on to this, is just saying all of this, the self-destructor kind of thing for that. Okay, and so you can read that. It's just what I've said before, and the conclusion: racist politics offer hatred as a solution, but of course it's not a solution. It's a kind of short-term gratification to elect people from the FTE sector, and as I've said before, by the top 1%, who in fact don't care at all about the poor, white or black. Okay, so finally, here we come to what can educators do? Since reforming the whole society is not in our power at this point, what we can do as educators is to help children transition from the low-wage sector to the FTC sector to prepare the students for college. Now, this is, of course, hard to do with inadequate funds. The repressive system opposes you, so that you have less funds than you would like to do this. So you're working against the tide of this. But we still have to make the effort. We could have better schools for everybody if the country wanted to have them. One of my colleagues once said, every country has the educational system that it wants to have, so on. Whereas in the dual economy, that means that the FTE sector wants it to have, and so on. So what kind of education helps? Well, skills, reading, writing, arithmetic. The ideas there that they're recognized and standardized tests are important. And those are the tests that are used to evaluate education very much. And they're used because, to come back to economists can measure these things and say, for this, how much, can you read the paragraph, can you add the numbers, and so on. And so you can get a score for that. But they are an important part of education, but not really the most important for it, because there is also a social aspect to education. Learning how to cooperate with people, learning to have trust in people, in a skill, not a measurable skill in the way our tests are set up today, but as important as the skills. Educators are just talking now and beginning to realize that when you have diversity in groups, everybody learns more. That when you encourage people to go together and work together, even if they're diverse when they come together, the very fact of being together makes these groups more productive. This is being observed in the workplace. It hasn't quite gotten itself into education. And why not? Because the 3 R's are the subject. People thinking about education in the FTE sector, and they're not thinking about how to deal with the low-wage sector. So socialization helps students solve problems, which is important in the FTE sector as it is in the low-wage sector, because solving problems is a complicated activity for that. And in fact, employers are now aware of this, and so they're looking for people to hire young people, not necessarily who have the skills and can solve equations, but rather people who can solve problems for coming. For that, I can say, for that and find that. And so I'd like to give a plug here for Lisa Del Pitt, who I think has written a lot and been active in thinking about education in the South. And for there, and her book, I like the title, Multiplication is for White People. This was said to her by a black student in a state like Mississippi, saying blacks learn to add, but white kids do the multiplication. You see, and that's the kind of attitude, the kind of expectation that we have to change in order for students to learn. And so the core of the educational philosophy that Lisa Del Pitt and other people talking about this poor education, but most of the literature is about northern urban black students. And you have a different problem in Mississippi. So Lisa is thinking, I don't know her, but talking to people here, Dr. Hammer, Ms. Shaw, they know her. So I feel familiar. She has focused on education in the South, why it's particularly useful, and the essence of this, if I try and distill this into a very brief statement here, which we'll talk about more in the afternoon, is that the normal practice of education, to start from the top of this slide, to teach kids reading and writing. That's what you do in the FTE sector, where kids come from households which have lots of books in it. They've been used there. They know what a book is. They know what you can get from it. Their expectations are that you will get useful things. Then they can use these tools to get to interesting projects and topics. And Del Pitt argues that for rural black students, just like the poor students in urban cities in the United States, Flint, Michigan, for example, you have to motivate the students. You can't start with this expectation. And so she proposes a series of research projects. That is to say, you start the students by trying to deal with questions, often questions about their lives. What are their parents doing? What is the community doing? Why are the school buildings falling down? All kinds of things that students can relate to. And in the process of trying to understand this question, and the teachers guide them through this, that then they get motivated to get the skills in the top line here to then go and learn the skills that they need to be able to answer these questions, and then even to progress to more technical questions, more abstract questions, which I, being an economic historian, I like it to think about the origins of slavery, think about the legacy of slavery, think about why the South is still poorer than the rest of the country. There are all kinds of issues that kids could learn, but you have to lead up to the more abstract issues. You can't start there. Start with things that they can connect with and lead them through it. So it's a kind of doing the same process that you would do for the FTE economy, but doing it in the reverse order. This is not how she says it. It's the way I'm recasting it in my context. So just to summarize, since if you remember nothing else from what I've said, look at that graph and weep. You know, that's the decline of the middle class, the shrinking of the middle class in the United States, which makes life incredibly hard for all of us in there. And so the United States is in trouble, increasing with rich, poor, and few in the middle. Public policies are perverse for most of us, that is to say, the 80% who are not in the FTE sector. So we need to do what we can within this system. The best thing we can do is to give our children the best start in life. We cannot predict the future, whether the politics will change. Who knows? Who knew that Justice Scalia was going to die last week? Such as that. We couldn't even predict that. But good education is the best investment. So, thank you very much.